Morning, everyone. So, we've just heard the Singaporean Home Affairs Minister talk about supply chains. We heard about supply chains again just before. And we know that's been the topic du jour in the last 3 years during the pandemic. I mean, it's certainly, the pandemic shattered a lot of these supply chain networks these networks that the globalized world has otherwise taken for granted, that it would continue on and on and on and on. There have been traffic jams at ports, labor lockdowns, expensive freight. And now there's more geopolitical pressures to sort of move towards, the words that have been bandied around: nearshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, protectionism, popularism, so on and so forth. Now, we've heard from these big topics earlier before, and it's a big topic, supply chain, so we're going to keep things a little bit more pragmatic, a little more practical. So today's conversation, we'll try and flesh out some of the practical points from people on the ground, so you can get some takeaways from our conversation. And we'll focus on opportunities in Vietnam. We'll talk about the lie of the land, in China and generally across supply chains. And then we will talk to Kati as well about, rules and regulations that would aid diversification if need be. Now, before we go on, I've got a bit of a nerd index for you. So I like to keep a very close eye on the World Container Index. So the one that I look at is Drewry, and so far this month, the World Container Index price has come down 83% from the peak price during the pandemic, and that's pretty good. So, price of a 40-foot container is looking very much closer to pre-pandemic, though not quite there yet. So this is a good sign. Things are turning around. But then something else is happening. So let's go to Justin, because he knows what's going on the ground. You want to give us a bit of a lie of the land of supply chain networks right now?
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Sulin? Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. I think driving back to retail, retailers globally are sitting on high inventory levels. So what's happened in 2021, 2022 was huge global demand as people were staying at home during the pandemic, buying things. That created the container freight cost surge. It actually went up almost 400%, 4 times. A 40-foot container from Shanghai to Long Beach right now is about $1,500 US. Our customers were paying up to $20,000 US or bidding more to get it at the spot rate. On top of that, raw materials went up, and all that kept up with demand, creating the inflationary environment we're in right now. That has created a halt to consumer demand globally. And so most US, Asian, European retailers are sitting on a lot of inventory, a lot of expensive inventory that had married with very weak Q4 sales, very weak Christmas sales, which carried on into weak first quarter sales. So they're trying to work through inventory right now as a result of that very low demand for supply chains globally. And manufacturers are probably sitting on 30% open capacity at the time. So it's not a great time in supply chain. It's sort of a reset, a deep breath after huge demand and no capacity. We're in the opposite situation.
And so you're looking at all these inventory now sitting in people's warehouses. So the reverse of what happened after the pandemic opened up. People were buying computers, television, furniture, and now they're not buying them. Is this hurting exports from this region? Is that what you're seeing generally?
Yeah, definitely. Everything's in cycles, so retailers need goods to sell. This is not an infinite situation. It's more of a quarterly situation. Retailers try to have just-in-time inventory. They actually moved their buying calendars forward 1 to 3 months because of the container situation. They had artificially inflated their inventory. So they have to work through it, and they will. We think by the second half, things will improve. But for the first half of 2023, demand is down double digits across the board, whether it's Australia, China, Hong Kong, US. So that's the current situation.
So it's a buyer's world now. So you've got, the exporters and the retailers, distributors are all having to scramble to change things around. So What are they looking to do to change things around?
That's interesting. The winners right now are discounters and dollar stores, as the global consumer is cash strapped. They're still buying, but they're buying less, and they're much more discerning about what they buy. So people still buy LVMH. All that stuff's a different world. So the manufacturers that are really responding are the ones selling normal consumer items. What they're doing is being much more flexible. The things that retailers want are cost, quality, innovation, and speed, which is a lot. And so the manufacturers just get on with it. Whether it's a Chinese, Indian, or Southeast Asian manufacturer, they're doing different things to respond to that need, like lower quantities, sharper costs, maybe definitely reducing margin, and maybe holding inventory in Asia for those retailers who also, there's a huge with the inventory sitting in US or European warehouses, there's no warehouse space, and the cost of warehousing is quite high. So a lot of Asian exporters are holding the goods in Asia.
So are consumers about to see cheaper prices? You know, if
Definitely.
people are doing deals to sort of flog off their inventory from their warehouses?
Yeah, I buy shoes a lot, running shoes. And if you go anywhere in the world, whether it's Hong Kong, Singapore, or New York, you'll get a half off. I mean, I think consumers are waiting for a deal. Consumers are not buying, I'm not, unless there's a motivation. So it's a heavy, heavy promotional environment as people want to work through that inventory. If you buy things at full price, you're probably not a savvy consumer right now, or you're buying LVMH.
So it's definitely a buyer's war at the moment. So now, you've been in and out of China, which is great, borders have opened. So you get to see on ground the supply chains there. Can you tell us what's going on there? Are things back to normal? Labor's back to normal? What's happening?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been in China a few times in the last few weeks. The China economy is not where it was. So, and the demand is down. So manufacturers are hungry and they want business. Different than the airline industry that furloughed, or the service industry that furloughed restaurant workers, airline pilots. Manufacturing, like I said, in 2021 and 2022 was booming. So they were retaining the labor. So the labor's there and ready. Oftentimes in China, post-Chinese New Year, manufacturing labor doesn't return or goes to service. The demand's not there, so they've all returned. And they never really left. So China's back in business. China was never out of business, but I can tell you it's business as usual, and they're hungrier than ever. And also, China's moved on in the last 3 years during the pandemic from mindset and sophistication. So yeah, we're trying to encourage buyers to come back, because the major change is that buyers haven't been in China for 3 years. 3 years. We used to have hundreds, 500 plus buyer visits a year. There's been zero, and that's not true. Some of the Europeans are more aggressive. They've been back like this month.
You're talking about the travel fairs and all these sort of conferences where people get together to do deals.
Yeah, and buying, just meeting, buyers meeting manufacturers and vice versa, has been virtual for the past 3 years, and now it's finally, excitingly back to physical.
So that's interesting. So the supply chains in China itself are still very much in place. They've always been there. It's just that consumption's really dead over pandemic, domestic consumption. Yeah. So nothing's really changed. So now that everything's opened up, are these connections that they used to have globally all coming back to life? There's been no...
Definitely. I mean, they never went dormant. They just went more virtual, but they're being re-accelerated, re-excited. American, Australian, Asian, European buyers want to engage with China. They've already started in India last year, Vietnam earlier, because they've been open. But China's just done a 180 and opened up quickly, and now all the pre-existing visas prior to 2001 are valid. So it's just getting people the momentum back at a higher level than it was.
I see, that's interesting. And then what about Chinese factories? Are they moving around the region? Because we're talking about this friend-shoring, near-shoring. They've got to be a bit smart. If no one wants to do, put their factories in China, work with just China, are the China manufacturers going elsewhere and setting up factories outside, say Vietnam?
Yeah, that's a good question. The more sophisticated a supply chain is, they were talking about Apple phones earlier, the more difficult it is to move. So first of all, you have to have desire to move. You have to have capability and scale. So the industries that have moved are the ones they spoke of earlier, like Foxconn or apparel, that you invest hundreds of millions of dollars in mills and factories. Less sophisticated cluster manufacturing, it's much more difficult to work because a manufacturer also needs a network of sub-suppliers. Basic apparel where there's just trim, cotton, fabric. Others are much more sophisticated, hundreds of intricate parts. So you have to have a desire to move as well. The Chinese manufacturers, we're trying to promote them to move to other origins, to take that expertise. Sometimes they do or don't want to. Maybe they've been successful or their next generation doesn't want to. But some of the beneficiaries have been Southeast Asia. Vietnam is, I think, is most geographically close, culturally close, but the population is 100 million versus 1.4 billion. So there's only so much you can move. So the other major beneficiary has been India, who has a population that's similar, but we don't see Chinese manufacturers moving to India. We have had a few coming the other way of mixed success. But I think that next wave of Chinese manufacturers going overseas, there have been some really great examples like technical accessories, electronic items, but hasn't really happened yet. But I think it will more and more.
Okay. I hear a lot of people say it's very hard to decouple out of China. I mean, once you're set up, you're set up. But in Vietnam, things might be very interesting because Fionn, you see the on-ground transactions. Do you see inquiries from either Chinese manufacturers or other, European American manufacturers going into Vietnam in full force in the last 3 years and certainly now that things have opened up?
So I think I just want to highlight that actually Vietnam's rise as a manufacturing hub is not just a recent trend. I think the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Taiwanese have gone into Vietnam more than 15 years ago, with the likes of Samsung and Foxconn setting up factories way back in 2007 and 2008. But having said so, this trend has definitely gained a lot of traction since 5 years ago, pre-COVID. And that is when BW, we as a company saw the need for ready-built infrastructure space, for logistics and industrial space. And that's when we also went into the market to meet this need. And we grew along with the demand. And now we are like the largest space provider with 8 million square meters of land and 2.1 million of space already in operation. So this is just testament to how much, growth there has been in terms of manufacturing needs and requirements coming into the country. Yeah. And speaking about supply chain, right? I think Justine spoke about how difficult it is to move the entire ecosystem and the supply chain. And I think many people, when considering Vietnam, this is definitely one of the key concerns. And I do think that it takes time to build. But as what I mentioned earlier, for investors considering Vietnam, I think they can rest assured that they are not coming into Vietnam totally on ground zero basis, not totally fresh, because people like the Samsung and the Foxconns have been building the ecosystem since more than 10 years ago. And I think, for example, Samsung reported recently that their Vietnamese tier 1 and 2 suppliers have grown tenfold since 10 years ago to more than 250 suppliers, and increasingly they are seeing that growing even further in the future years ahead.
The inquiries, though, in the past 3 years, have they been more than ever compared to years and years before, given this need to onshore, bring your manufacturers home? Has there been sort of that?
So obviously, there is a bit of a disruption during COVID, but ever since the last 6 months, we have seen inquiries back to pre-COVID level. And this quarter particularly, we have been very, very busy. My sales team is every day on the ground showing sites to investors who are looking to expanding or setting up factories in Vietnam. I think despite, everybody knows Vietnam is very dependent on export orders, and definitely export orders this year have been hit badly. with the drop, with the global recessionary outlook. But many companies who are talking to us right now are actually planning ahead. They're actually thinking about catching the economic rebound in the second half of 2024. And in order to be ready for that, they have to start looking now. And this is the reason why we are busy, because they are getting ready for what is coming.
And these inquiries are from existing investors in Vietnam, or they're new and coming in from elsewhere for the first time ever?
Yeah, I think we see a mix of both. The big ones are already here, so and they are expanding. We are also seeing smaller ones who are new to Vietnam and coming to set up in Vietnam. And the other thing we see is that and increasingly, a lot of them who are setting up new plants in Vietnam, for example, the tier 1 or the higher level suppliers, they are also talking to us about reserving space in advance. So for example, when they are looking for land for 10 hectares for their factory, they will say, they will talk to us and say, hey, can you reserve space, X thousand square meters of space for my future suppliers? They're going to come along with me once I'm ready. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So they've ignored all that friendshoring business. They're actually looking at their business, and they're looking ahead, far, far ahead. Is that what you're seeing as well, Justin? What Fionn was saying, that people are just ignoring the geopolitical pressures, really. They're just looking at how to do business, essentially.
Yeah, I think this is the practical session, like you said, and manufacturers, they stay in business, they look forward. In the past, maybe they looked at a different geographic site in China. Yeah. So maybe had someone in Shenzhen looking at Fujian or wherever. Now they're looking at other origins. They don't always move, but they definitely are thinking ahead. It also depends on the situation. There's so many factors of that individual manufacturer, from cash flow to desire to future orders. But I totally agree with Fionn. The second half, I don't want to be over ambitious, but it is definitely going to be better. And then I am more ambitious about 2024. And so yes, manufacturers are definitely not living in a hole planning just for the bad first half. Some are, but the winners are looking to the second half into 2024 and beyond.
I see. And Fionn, are people very keen on diversification? Is that front and center of their minds, or are they, to what you were saying and Justin saying before, they don't really care about that, just want to get on with their business regardless of these political pressures?
I'm sure with increasing uncertainties, with the geopolitical tensions, and COVID shocks and potential future shocks like this, I think definitely strengthening the resilience in their supply chain is probably one of the topmost priorities in their mind. And the diversification into Vietnam is probably part of the strategy to build diversity into their supply chain.
Yeah. Does that make everything more expensive for manufacturers wanting to set up in Vietnam or anywhere else outside China right now? I mean, because everyone's looking to diversify out of just China, or their China Plus strategy. Is it expensive?
Yeah, it's interesting. It definitely impacts the big things in cost of goods are labor. People look at currency, stability, but labor's gone up. The Vietnamese talent pool is smaller, so there's been a marked increase in the cost of labor. I don't know about the land or the manufacturing. Overall, the biggest input into cost of goods is demand. And so manufacturers have extra capacity, lower demand, so they're definitely more aggressive right now. But overall, those cost inputs will rise as more manufacturers go into India, Indonesia, Vietnam. But right now, there's still a cost advantage. But then you have to think about quality and infrastructure and all those other factors as well.
What about land, Fionn? Is it expensive?
Oh, it has definitely gone up quite a fair bit. So we are very glad as a company that we actually built up quite a sizable land bank since 5 years ago. Yeah, but I think Vietnam, compared to its, despite the increase that Justin mentioned, I think compared to its Southeast Asia regional peers, Vietnam still ranks very competitively, not just against Thailand and Malaysia, but also against Indonesia and Philippines, for example.
So across the board, across the region, lands, all space, storage, everything's gone up?
I think land price have definitely gone up, yeah. But I think labor cost is still competitive compared to the region. And the ease of doing business in Vietnam, having, for me, having invested, looking at investment across Southeast Asia, I think Vietnam is one of the easiest place to do business. Yeah.
Are your manufacturers, are people inquiring, are they looking at other regions, other countries as well, outside of Vietnam? I mean, when they come to you, they say, keep some space for me, but are they also doing things in the Philippines and elsewhere?
Yeah, definitely. So some of them, for example, could be in Malaysia, and they are looking at, setting up another plant in Vietnam, for example. Yeah, or they could be in, for example, we have a lot of Europeans also coming, looking at North Vietnam in particular.
Maybe I can add a comment. Is our average retail customer sources from 10 to 12 origins on average, depending on the time of year. So a retailer also needs, if you're making just semiconductors or, sensitive topic, it's one item. But most retailers have some of our retailers have 30,000 SKUs. Somebody Australian, the company Bunnings has 50,000. You don't get that from one origin. So you have to source. Yes. Now with COVID shocks and geopolitical issues, it's even more at a board level, more front and center. But any retailer, even without these shocks, would want to manufacture in different regions as well. Whether it's mainly been Asia, but India subcontinent, Africa, EMEA. So I think any good retailer has a diversified strategy right now.
Right. And Fionn, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, definitely. I think most of them will have multiple factory sites. They will not just put in Vietnam entirely. They probably already have other factories, and Vietnam is then one additional site that they're considering.
Right, that's interesting. Now I'm just going to move on to Kati here, who has been with us for a bit. Kati is an expert on, the region's rules and standards and regulations. And I'm just drawing from the RCEPs and CPTPPs, the multilateral gameplay plan in the region. What are you saying? What are the top 2 rules and standards do you think are helping manufacturers and investors diversify better in the region?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Learning a lot. Great panel. Just to, before I go into the trade agreements, just to echo what the colleagues have said here about diversification of supply sources as well as of export markets. What we have seen, perhaps in a somewhat different segment of firms than is being discussed here, we've run a big survey of 4,000 companies, mid-sized companies and small firms in the Asia-Pacific region as well as in the Americas, to ask them what has happened to them during COVID and what they have done with their trade and supply chains and so forth. And we discovered that 60% of the companies that we surveyed had diversified their import sources and export markets. And that was actually really significant to me. And it seemed that the companies that had been undergoing that kind of diversification were very digitized companies as well. They were the ones that were engaged in e-commerce and sourcing through digital platforms. And these are, of course, smaller companies, perhaps retailers that are seeking to diversify also their sources of supply. And they seem to be outperforming. So it was those companies that were digitizing and diversifying their export markets and import sources that outperformed significantly the other markets. And really what we have seen here, perhaps reflecting a little bit in the US and in the Americas, is very much what the colleagues were saying, is that yes, there was a little bit of a dip of kind of China and demand from China during COVID 2018, 2021. There was something like a drop from 24% to 20% of China's share in US imports. But so that was there was something there, but it was kind of rather moderate. Where the big change was in telecommunications and semiconductors. And my understanding was that much of that moved indeed to Vietnam. So US companies sourcing, particularly in those sectors, more from Vietnam. There's been a lot of talk here in the Western Hemisphere about nearshoring to Latin America as well, particularly in areas like auto, manufacturing, textiles, renewable energy from Asia. And I think there's a lot of expectation and hope that this would happen because it would stimulate the Western Hemisphere economies in Central America, Mexico, Brazil as well. But my sense is, looking at the data as well, that there's some movement, but it's very sectoral, it's company specific, and it's probably not the kind of revolution that we were thinking about a couple of years ago. So I think things are starting to be back to normal. When it comes to CPTPP and RCEP, and these are of course kind of transformative trade agreements in the region, providing companies, I think, more than anything, certainty that there are some rules of the game and there is tariff reduction schedules that are taking place over time that provide for more open markets. And this is all very good. I think in both regions, tariff liberalization in markets like Vietnam and other markets, Philippines and so forth, is gradual. So it's hard to see immediate effects of these agreements on supply chains, since these agreements have just come online recently. What we did see, however, in a study that we did on CPTPP, is that Vietnam was the one country in the CPTPP region where foreign direct investment held up pretty well during COVID, and also exports grew and imports grew during COVID, unlike in the other countries. So, whether that can be attributable to CPTPP is another question mark. We don't know yet. We need some more data, but at least, there's indications that perhaps this accession to a large groundbreaking trade agreement, which was Vietnam's first, has resulted in further trade, or at least cemented investors' interest in Vietnam. Now, there is still, in Vietnamese case, particularly for people who are trying to bring goods in, there is, I think, kind of paperless trade and customs procedures that need to be improved. When you look at Vietnam's peers in CPTPP, they have much more digitized customs procedures, border processes than Vietnam. At least what I see in data and in paper, it may be somewhat different in practice, and I'll love to hear that from colleagues. And so that's definitely one, is that even though these agreements commit countries to things like paperless trade and digitized processing of papers that companies need to submit in order to import products, there are still implementation hurdles, right, to assume these obligations in countries like Vietnam and others. So that would be one. And then the other is just, I think we need much more digitized trade documentation in general, and things like bills of lading, which, as all of the participants I'm sure know and have firsthand experience, are oftentimes still analog and not digitized. And this is causing hiccups in the trade process, causing undue burdens of paperwork for exporters and importers. So I think these documents like bills of lading, cargo manifests, customs declarations, and so forth, they add to the tremendous pile of paper that exporters and importers need to submit. Larger companies are able to deal with them because they have the human capacity, the departments to work through these issues. But for smaller businesses, these are real costs and limit perhaps the diversification of smaller businesses across markets. So if I were to pick two things, I would promote the digitization of border processes, and then digitization, of course, of these some trade documents like bills of lading as a supporting of the supply chain diversification.
So I've got two questions for you, actually, Kati. You said you looked at the survey and you noticed that 60% of who you surveyed have diversified. Now, was it easy for them? What were the key challenges in actually achieving that diversification in the past 3 years? Were there
that's actually an interesting question. We didn't go much into that, like what was the challenge in diversifying. What the real challenges are going forward, I think companies cited precisely the issues that I mentioned, kind of dealing with the multitude of trade regulations in different markets, the diversity of market access rules, as well as the trade documentation, deal with multiple providers as well. So if you're a small business or mid-sized business, you're dealing with so many different intermediaries as well, and managing all of them is another challenge. And overall, the shipping costs that colleagues were mentioning in the panel were really heavy on the companies. So we asked companies, well, looking forward into 2020, 2024, what are your main concerns? And they said that, of course, the fear of kind of recession and inflationary pressures were top concerns. But immediately after that was high shipping cost, and as they are seeking to manage their imports and exports. So I think they've been seeking diversification as a growth lever, during COVID as an insurance policy, perhaps, but there are still significant challenges, I think, to work through with particularly the orchestrating the logistics.
I'm going to segue to Fionn for a second. Those people who are inquiring about going into Vietnam, I mean, what should they expect in terms of red tape in the country? What are the top two issues that they need to be wary of? And how is the red tape, at the moment?
Yeah. As with every developing country, there will be red tape, right? So it's about finding the right way into the country and navigating the landscape. So I think finding the right partners to go into the market is important.
Such as yourself?
Yeah,
or
so for example, we actually provide services to help companies get their investment approvals as well as operating permits. I think these are the two key challenges when a manufacturer comes into, want to set up a plant, right? First, they have to get the investment regulatory approval. Next, they need to get their operating permits to literally start operations. Yeah, and this is where BW, we come in to help them, support them so that they can do a quick startup and also provide future space for future expansion for them.
Right. So you're saying operating permits and all that. How does that compare to, say, China? If, those wanting to go to Vietnam. Yeah. Is it a faster process, slower? What are we looking at?
So the China and the Vietnam system is very different. So for China, a lot of the times the land actually comes directly allocated from the government. So you basically talk to the government, tell them what you're planning to invest in there, and then, hopefully what you're planning to do will bring the local government a lot of taxes, and that's how you lobby for your space. But in Vietnam, the land is actually not directly from the government. It's actually very much privatized through state-owned enterprise as well as private entities who set up major industrial parks. And these are all, business-oriented entities. And this is why it makes it easier, because you can then, basically, it's all commercial, right? Yeah, you can approach these, which are very foreign investor friendly and also very experienced in helping foreign investors set up plants and industrial parks.
So it's actually easier because of the being privatized, groups of.
I would say if you're a smaller player, it's easier, because the big players is always easy to lobby the government, but a smaller player would be more difficult, right? But in Vietnam, you can actually get land through, private entities and industrial parks and players like ourselves.
And what about the government processes? I mean, assuming they have someone like you or another agent, is that a seamless process, or is there sort of back and forth and, knockbacks and going back in again and applying for things?
There will be a little bit of that, but I think if you were to be able to get access to the key people who are handling your processes and, meeting up with them directly and understanding their concerns and therefore amending and in response to their concerns, I think that can be easily solved.
And this is where I go to you, Kati. You said earlier, people coming into Vietnam, for example, they will find that, for example, the CPTPP, RCEP, commits, countries like Vietnam to more, seamless processes like, more digitization. But it's still very much paper-oriented, and it's still there's a lot of paper to worry about. So is that what you're saying for people who want to go into Vietnam? For example, we're talking about Vietnam here. And is there, as you said, how long is it going to take for Vietnam, for example, to meet these more advanced requirements or commitments of RCEP and CPTPP? So it becomes easier.
Yeah, that's a great, absolutely a great question. And I think exactly what colleagues were saying about the need to have local partners if you're brand new to Vietnam and need to manage these processes of setting up and so forth. And then certainly, you can have partners that understand all the trade processes, customs lawyers and freight forwarders and this and that to manage the processes of moving goods in and out. Really, I think it depends on Vietnam itself, how it can move as quickly as it wants in terms of digitizing the customs procedures. And there's been progress that has been made, but and Vietnam has committed to certain things also in the Global Trade Facilitation Agreement. But I think companies certainly in the US would love to see a faster progress. from Vietnam's part in this regard, in trade facilitation. And in general, when we look at the Asia-Pacific region, countries have assumed more paperless trade commitments. They have digitized their trade processes, and there was a wave of this during COVID, just because it was physically impossible for people to be together and inspect products and so forth. But there's concern now with the delivery companies and logistics sector that this process of reform has slowed down, or perhaps even being reversed. So we're kind of reverting back to paper, and that's a concern that logistics players have. So, I would say, Vietnam can move as quickly as it wishes, and I'm sure given that there is so much interest from companies in locating in Vietnam, there will probably be technical assistance from public-private partnerships that can support Vietnam in accomplishing those goals.
So who's policing these trade agreements? I mean, as you're saying, things that, digitizing paper and making it easier for people to go into Vietnam is, the reform is slowing down. I mean, what's the point of having CPTPPR set if no one's, gearing up and getting there and making sure that all the countries playing in those agreements are doing exactly what everyone else is doing? So everyone's digitized, at a certain time. Who's policing all that?
Yeah, that's $1 trillion question. So, of course, at the global level, we have the World Trade Organization that has a review of countries' performance against what they have committed at the multilateral level, called trade policy reviews. And these are undertaken every now and then, and countries are subjected to a peer review. In terms of these regional agreements, we have actually been working with colleagues from the technology sector on kickstarting this sort of a monitoring process of how countries are complying with their commitments, particularly in the area of digital trade. For instance, the e-commerce chapter that commits countries to certain things in the digital sphere, like enabling free flows of data across borders and not putting customs duties on electronic transmissions and things like that. And so there is really, countries can, of course, kind of sue each other in a dispute settlement mechanism under these agreements, but they, like to avoid doing so. And I think this kind of monitoring of the implementation has to come probably from the private sector first and foremost, and business associations in the region. In the United States, of course, companies and business associations have been also very vocal about how countries are implementing their commitments in these agreements. Even if the US is not part of it, companies, of course, are in the region. So I think this is a really critical issue that you raise, and we as the private sector probably need to take the lead in kickstarting this kind of a process of really holding countries' feet to the fire.
It's true. Maybe these multilateral agreements might be dinosaurs that move at very slow paces. So I've got a couple of questions, and they're around semiconductors and industry in Asia. So I think I might start with the big one. Someone's asked about, the strategy for ASEAN to shore up the semiconductor industry in the region amid tensions between the US and China. Can ASEAN diversify and provide more resilience to the semiconductor industry and supply chain? Justin, you have any thoughts?
I'm probably not the best expert on the semiconductor industry, so maybe I'd say more of what they can do, because I'm not an expert on what ASEAN's policies are, or from a collaborative perspective. But I think the more sophisticated supply chain you have, the more you need expertise and talent. And so you don't just move from Taiwan to China to Indonesia to Vietnam without having a very thorough plan from raw material to land, but also talent. And it's the efficiency of the labor force. So when people are looking at the Americas or EMEA or Asia, they have to look at the expertise. And so I think what ASEAN can do in that case, whether it's a more sophisticated product or industry like semiconducting, is you have to start with how you're going to either, we talked a lot about other companies moving, but also using the local private sector to build up their own and to identify what those talent needs are, what education needs you have. So you have to start, as much as manufacturing is all automated and efficient, you have to have the people part as well.
So it's knowledge to build up a solid semiconductor industry in the region. So it's bringing all these experts. Can you just go up to Taiwan and China and say, come on over, start that up?
I think maybe to the owners you can, but it comes down to the labor force. When we look at new markets all the time, and less sophisticated, it's even an issue. Even for T-shirts, it's an issue because you need efficiency. So you have to offset. There's an offset of the cost of labor, say from China's $300, $350 a month, to some places are $150 or less. But if the efficiency is 3 times less, you're not going to move it. So it's really getting that knowledge is sometimes manufacturing setup, modular manufacturing, raw materials. There's many factors. But yeah, you need to transfer the know-how and then to the local population, the expertise to efficiently manufacture as well.
Right. Is anyone trying to set up semiconductor factories all over Vietnam? Fionn, are you seeing that growing in Vietnam?
I don't think there are major announcements. Maybe there's some considering, but I think, there are a lot of considerations when talking about moving semiconductor, and I'm no expert either, but other than talent, I think there's also a lot of resources involved, water, electricity, land, so to welcome an investment like that would take a lot of considerations.
Who needs to be more involved? The governments of these countries, say, put out policies that invite semiconductor talent into their countries?
Yeah, again, stepping back from semiconductor, you have to look at infrastructure. And I think the previous panel talked about other markets, and where China's excelled is in the infrastructure. Physical roads, and they're spending $15 billion more. But so is India. India's, I think, earmarked $15 billion. Vietnam, I think, is 6% of GDP. So I think the governments are switched on to what's necessary, but so there's the idea, then there's the implementation of that idea.
Is there room for another multilateral agreement on shoring up semiconductor industries in this region? A get-together, a bit of an ASEAN semiconductor friendship club or something like that.
Yeah, why not? That might be a very good idea, particularly in the time of geopolitical tensions. What we did see in this one study that I looked at recently was that the semiconductor and telecom imports to the U.S. from China have been down. They're the 2 industries where there's significant drop, at least in the past couple of years. And who gained in U.S. import basket was Vietnam, precisely in those industries. So it seems that there is already some changes going on, at least from the U.S. side, in light of the geopolitical issues. However, at the same time, like other industries from China have been increasing their exports or share in U.S. import basket, like in computers or agricultural products and things like that of machinery. And so it cuts still both ways in terms of China's imports to the U.S. But perhaps there is an opportunity for ASEAN precisely in that sector in light of the geopolitical issues that will probably not go away.
Is it achievable, though, for ASEAN to get together and push for a semiconductor industry or to band together? We've seen, all kinds of multilateral agreements can be very flawed and very slow. But is it possible, or is it something out of the not?
Yeah, and perhaps it doesn't even have to be an agreement. Perhaps it's more of a public-private partnership of some kind or so forth. Just depends on what the barriers are to overcome. And I agree with colleagues. It much depends on the kind of infrastructure and the quality of workforces and things like that to be able to operationalize these industries. So it could be something else than an agreement. It may be improving the capabilities of the countries in general in this area.
Well, that's great. So all you folks go out there and talk about public-private partnerships for semiconductors suppliers in the region. I think that's all we have for today. So any other questions, come up and talk to our experts and Kati online. Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you.